A face-to-face meeting in Doha between Rwanda's President Paul Kagame and his DRC counterpart Felix Tshisekedi signaled the entry of Gulf states in efforts to resolve the DR Congo crisis, which has drawn global attention since M23 rebels seized large swathes of the country. The African Union Commission AUC backed the Qatar meeting. Angola, which led the Rwanda process, expressed a surprise and announced ending its mediation role. Now, apart from Qatar, Saudi Arabia is also an active mediator in Sudan and the Horn of Africa region, signifying Gulf countries' growing influence on the continent. So this week on the program, we examine implications of Qatar's entry into the search for peace in the DRC, the wider role of Gulf states in African conflicts, and what this means for Africa's desire to solve its own problems. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. To exert their influence, Gulf states have significantly expanded their investments, pumping billions of dollars into key sectors of Africa's economy. Let's now take a look at the scale of their economic footprint on the continent.
The Gulf Cooperation Council includes countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar and Bahrain. Between 2012 and 2022, these nations collectively invested over $100 billion in Africa. The UAE has become the largest backer of new business projects on the continent. Between 2012 and 2022, it invested some $59.4 billion in Africa, making it the fourth largest foreign direct investor in the region. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia announced it would provide at least $41 billion in funding for sub-Saharan Africa in October 2024. It has also attempted to mediate the conflict in Sudan between the army and the Rapid Support Forces. Qatar has intensified its economic engagement with the African continent in the past decade, directing investments into pivotal sectors such as aviation, energy, infrastructure and finance. It has also moved in to mediate talks between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda over the escalating violence in eastern DRC.
Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts to discuss the entry of Qatar into the DRC peace process and the role of Gulf states in African conflicts. Joining me here in Nairobi, Dr. Mustafa Ali, co-founder and chairman, Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. In Doha via Zoom, Dr. Mahjoub Zuwairi, professor of contemporary Middle East politics at the Qatar University. And in Dakar, Senegal, also via Zoom, Oluwole Ojewale, regional coordinator for Central Africa at the Institute for Security Studies. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us in our discussion. Now, the presidents of the DRC and Rwanda met face-to-face in Qatar for their first direct talks since the M23 rebels, which is reportedly backed by Rwanda, seized two major cities in eastern DRC earlier this year. First of all, let me start off with you, Dr. Zuwairi, and get your view. Why did the leaders meet after rejecting successive SADC and EAC dialogue invitations?
The reputation and the weight of Qatar when it comes to the mediation has approved that it's a trustworthy mediator and a mediator with a very clear vision that the more you have stability, the more you have the effective diplomacy that would serve nations wherever those nations are. I think in this context, we saw what happened on this meeting in Doha, hosted by the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim. That was a strong indicator that both sides have accepted strongly the role that Qatar is playing. Let me highlight an important point in this context. In the world of mediation, no mediation process can succeed unless both parties are trusting the mediator and they believe on the ability of the mediator. I think the meeting we watch on Doha happening in last 2 weeks, that was a strong gesture of the
Right.
trust of both sides of Qatar to play that role.
Oluwole, I want to get your take. Is this about trusting the process, the negotiation? Why did the leaders meet after rejecting SADC and EAC invitations?
The starting point is to say that the people in DRC, particularly those who are the forefront of the war in Eastern DRC, are in desperate need of peace now. And the people really care about where that peace is going to come from or who is going to mediate that peace. But I must also say that the Qatar mediation, particularly since that meeting brought together Tshisekedi and Kagame, and Tshisekedi, who has been absent in all meetings and negotiations that we've seen in the effort of the EAC and SADC to bring about negotiation, then it raises question for most Pan-Africanists on the continent to say, where is the role of AU in this? If middle power countries, emerging nations like Qatar and the other Gulf states are now the ones that are having critical roles to play, it appears that the whole development is putting African Union on the back seat. And it also goes to show that it appears that African leaders don't listen to their peers. They listen to those who probably have the lever of influence over them. So why I underscore the fact that the people in Eastern DRC desperately need peace, it shows that the African solution of African content is largely missing or ignored and is being relegated to the back seat in this whole development.
Dr. Mustafa, this raises an important question. Where is the role of the African Union in all this? And does this decision reflect a lack of confidence in regional bodies like the East African Community or SADC? Or is it more about seeking a neutral third party like Dr. Zweri has pointed out?
Thank you, Bitri. In some ways, DRC leader and Rwandese leader going to Doha to meet with the emir there to address what is a particularly and peculiarly an African problem shows that there is some a lack of confidence on the African Union, the IGAD and the SADC and any other regional groupings, political groupings here in the region. But there is more than that. Mahjoub talked about the fact that Qatar is one of the most trusted mediators, and it's not just this particular conflict. It's also Qatar helped in the mediation of the conflict in Afghanistan between the Taliban and the government. They've also been helping out with the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. Secondly, Beatrice, there is some strategic interest here. Qatar has invested quite some significant sovereign strategic wealth in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also in Rwanda. It's helping to build, and it actually owns 60% of one of the largest airports in the region, and therefore it is in the interest of Qatar to have a peaceful, stable region.
Oluwole, you're hearing about the strategic, interest of Qatar here. Do you agree that it is not just about the financial implication? And again, what leverage does Qatar have on DRC and Rwanda to make a face-to-face meeting happen despite invitations from other quarters that did not bear that fruit?
Let's start on the note that in international relations and diplomacy, national interest comes first, and there is hardly altruism. Nobody gives anything for free. Qatar or any other actors that is participating in the peace process definitely has strategic interest. I heard the previous speaker talking about the investment that Qatar has made in Rwanda here, or maybe even in strategic minerals that are sorely needed by almost every country in the world, which Congo has in abundance. It is in the strategic interest of Qatar to get involved in that regard. The second issue, which is very important, is that every country now is trying to elevate our status in the global scheme of things as a strategic player. So Qatar got involved in this, not necessarily for altruism, because Qatar has strategic interest in the crisis in DRC, has invested significantly, and we need to emphasize that. But it's a bad taste for most people in Africa.
Right. So I want to look beyond that. And Dr. Mustafa, I want to look at the reaction from Africa, because Angola said it was caught by surprise and announced its decision to end its mediation efforts in that conflict. How is it that Angola's president, who is also the current African Union chairperson, was unaware of the Doha meeting, despite it being backed by the African Union? What exactly does this say about divisions within the AU regarding mediation efforts?
Yeah, I think there's some kind of dysfunctionalism within the Africa Union, particularly at this time when they've just elected a new chairperson of the Africa Union Commission. I think there's been very limited a flow of information between the Commission itself and the political leadership of the Africa Union, for which the Angolan president is chairing at the moment. And I'm sure the Angolan president was caught flat-footed. This means, Beatrice, that the Africa Union has to go back to the drawing boards when it speaks about its 2063 vision, silencing the guns. Silencing the guns on the continent and the 2063 vision is not going to be achieved by actors from outside Africa. It's got to be organic, and it's got to start from Africa, and therefore there is a lot of work for the Africa Union to do to first of all reclaim its position on the continent, and also to go to dig deep into addressing these conflicts that are affecting many of the African countries.
So, Dr. Zweri, there were other actors, looking at the peace process in the DRC, the EAC, SADC, the European Union, the African Union. So what does the entry of Qatar really mean for those other actors of the peace process?
I think in the last 30, 40 years, every mediation has more than one player. It basically caused more complications rather than solutions, because there is a saying in Arabic: if you want to cook a meal and you have many hands cooking the meal, it's likely the meal will be burned. It's exactly the politics and mediation. Mediation succeed when there is one focused player accepted, approved by the both sides of the conflict, and that has the ability, has the reputation, and has the brand. And interestingly, we have done a research for around 2 years on linking or trying to understand the economic aid and the mediation. And we found out that Qatar is paid more money to the countries which has less diplomatic ties, more than the countries which have more diplomatic ties, which means that the main driven of their mediation and ties is not only their self-interest, economic interest. There is another side of it. I'm not saying this to say it's perfect and Qatar is a hero in the world, but these are a result of the studies we have done, and we convey this to the decision maker and saying, guys, your interest in politics, as one of the colleague has indicated, your interest, number one, where is your interest in what you're doing now? You need to focus on your interest more. So just wanted to highlight that the main reason of this kind of success and trust is when they enter in a mediation, they focus, they bring elements, they try to convince, they take the time, and more importantly, they are human on focusing on the mediation.
So, Oluwale, what has changed in the DRC conflict since the Qatar meeting?
Well, I think to a large extent, there is a sense that we are probably at the beginning of the end. Based on my feelers with people in the DRC and the events that I've also been covering, we can say we are probably at the beginning of the end. And the reason is because we will not be talking about this if either of the party had also been absent in the Qatar meeting. And then what has changed, we can look at it from different contradictions. Let me put it that way. One, this slipping out of the African Union table, I mean, the Angola president, is about the most promising process that everybody has been talking about. So I think diplomatically, a lot has changed in that direction, because there is now misuse of trust, or maybe lack of trust. It shows that the parties involved will probably prefer to listen to somebody or an entity outside Africa who has a strong lever on them. So that's put a serious question mark on the capacity of the African agency to be able to provide solution to the internal contradictions on the continent. We have to highlight that. The second issue is that lately, the issue of attacks, violence, I think since that negotiation has also become a bit malleable, in the sense that incident reported has not occupied the front burner as we have seen it before. But like they say in East Africa, we must say that it is not yet Uhuru, because you don't have peace until both parties in conflict are committed to compromise here and there. Somebody have to give and another have to take, and another, I mean, it has to go the other way around. It is at that point that we can say we are probably gravitating towards peace. But as things stand now, I think there's a marginal shift in the direction of peace. And the conversation must be consolidated before we can say there's peace, because the issues in DRC have historical and cultural dimensions.
Dr. Mustafa, your take: should African nations embrace external mediation or retain a Pan-Africanist view?
I think it's very critical that African nations retain a Pan-African mediation led by either the regional economic blocs, SADC, ECOWAS for those conflicts in the West Africa and in Eastern Africa, the East African Community, and for IGAD countries, IGAD, supported by the Africa Union. And the reason for this is that we understand the challenges here better. The challenge has been in this situation is that there's so much distrust among heads of states in the region, and also a certain level of distrust on the Africa Union leadership. However, you know, states like Qatar, which have played excellent roles in mediation around the world, can still play a role by accompanying the Africa Union, by accompanying SADC, IGAD, the East African Community, to make sure that we have a long-lasting solution to the problems that have bedeviled these places for a very long time. Many African countries have lost trust also with the European powers, because they come in, they've been trying to help for a very long time, but these trials have not succeeded. They come with quite a huge baggage in the form of a colonial baggage. So having Qatar is a breath of fresh air coming in. However, there is need for closer coordination of all these efforts, and that these solutions are founded within the African soil itself.
Indeed. On that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion on the Gulf states' growing presence in Africa and what it means for Africa's search for homegrown solutions. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Dr. Mustafa Ali, Dr. Majub Zweri, and Oluwole Ojewale. Oluwole, now Gulf states are increasingly playing a role in African conflict resolution, particularly in Sudan, DRC, and the Horn of Africa. Does this meeting, though, indicate a shift in Africa's diplomatic alignments from Africa's traditional partners in the West towards Gulf cooperation countries?
Yes, African countries' relations with the external world has become diffuse in the recent time. And you've seen what the nations that I would consider as middle power and emerging countries also playing strategic roles, both pros and cons in terms of how conflict in Africa is being framed now because of the strategic interest that they have in Africa. And I think it also fits into the larger conversation about what some scholars have described as the third scramble for Africa. We've had the first wave in which you have the Europeans, then later we have the American, and then the Gulf states are also playing very strategic roles in military support and other foreign assistance that you can imagine on the continent now. So we will also expect that if they have made significant investment in trade and investment on the continent, they will also want to exert some influence. Like I mentioned, why the soft power dimension and the economic dimension cannot be underemphasized. But the big deal is that every country wants to show that they are big players on the global scene now. As an African, I'm much more worried that Africans cannot play strategic roles in the conflict that is happening outside the African continent. And we can't say when countries are stretching their limits to also exert their global influence on the continent. If you make yourself available as the backyard where they can come and play all those roles, whether for the positive or the negative, they are going to come. So I put the responsibility of our home vacation, of our primary responsibility on the leaders on the continent,
right,
who are always going around wearing a Armani suit and everything, and then coming back without really exerting any significant influence on the global scene. Africa provides that playing ground now for global competition for countries that want to exert their influence.
So, Dr. Mustafa, in the Sudan conflict, though, the Gulf states appear aligned to different actors in that conflict, the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces. How can they then successfully mediate when their interests are divided between protagonists?
I think Sudan is a very special case here, a kind of an outlier in the mediation process, and we see the different actors in from the Gulf region siding with different sides. At the core of it, Beatrice, is that all those